Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Did you know the Wall Street Journal has ranked Cedarville #2 in the nation for student engagement? Our faculty are intentional about connecting with students and equipping them for professional success and gospel impact. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
So let's get back to finishing up the story of Abraham. And I want to do it like this. We've been through this. The key idea is that he gets swindled. He admits he's an alien and a stranger, which means the land promises are not fulfilled yet, which seems like a discouraging thing, but in fact it's not. It is just absolutely true and agrees with what Hebrews 11 says. They did not receive those things which were promised, right? Even though they admitted they were aliens and strangers, and that's exactly the phrase used in Genesis 23 in this passage of the death of Sarah. So we know that that's what the writer of Hebrews was talking about. But God promised that with us they would receive the promises. And so the whole big idea of the tree of life, he did not get it, we have not gotten it, but man, someday, that's going to be glory. Right? So to take a look at the story of Abraham, you kind of have to chart him out here and say that he is the answer to Babel. That fragmentation, breaking up into nations at Babel, is answered by Abraham. Now, not immediately, but at least the promise for the reunification of all the nations of the earth, it's there in Genesis 12:3. So we did this with 4 to 11. We could do it with 12 to 25 as well. And say that as you read through those stories, in chapter 12, he abandons his wife. He tries the adopt-a-seed program. He sleeps with a maid in 16. In 17, he laughs. In 20, he abandons his wife again, and then he sacrifices the seed. But all of that just totally merges together under the theme, under the umbrella of this idea of land, nation, and leader, which is really just an expansion of Genesis 3. So that again, I think you're beginning to see this, that this is one incredibly coherent story where the author who starts it out knows exactly where he's going, and the one who's creating the history knows exactly where the history is going, and it's all going to a really, really good end. So if we're careful and read the story in that light, we're going to pick up a whole lot more of what's actually going on. So, last thing I want to say to you about Abraham is this. And this, I think, is kind of fascinating. Because what it does for us is when we read this passage we're going to read in James chapter 2, you realize you got a New Testament guy interpreting the Old. In fact, you got Jesus' half-brother, right, interpreting the Old Testament about the storyline. And so you can be pretty sure it's going to be really good. And you now will be able to understand it. And here's why. James says, "Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar?" Obviously, Genesis chapter 22. And then he says this, "And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." Now, this is fascinating because chapter 22 is where he starts, but he goes and he says what's fulfilled is Genesis 15:6, right? Remember that really important statement. And God said to him, "Your children will be like the stars of the heaven." And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. But as we moved through the stories last time, we saw that Abraham believed in the very beginning. That's why he left Ur. But then his faith fails. But then he believes, and then it fails. But then he believes, right? And Genesis 15 was one of those early points, early good points, where he's believing. But as we kept saying, are you going to do this again? Huh? And the answer is, no, I won't do it again. But then he does. But then when he gets to chapter 22, as we said, that is incredible flying color faith. I mean, he's just really made it. And that's exactly what James is saying, right? When you get to Genesis 22, the scripture from Genesis 15:6 was filled up. He's not trying to say it was a prophecy. He's trying to say that even though he did believe there, he really believes in 22. And 22 is the pinnacle expression of the faith which God was building into his life, right? And so it confirms what we were looking at as we saw God building, getting better and better and better. Now, here is the part that I don't want you to miss. All of this leads up to the climax in James' mind when he says, and he was called God's friend. Now, you might look at that and say, oh, that's kind of sappy, or oh, isn't that cute, or oh, that's really sentimental. He was called God's friend. Isn't that nice? Right? Never accomplished anything really, really big, but he did that. Could I just say that in light of what the goal of Scripture is, in light of what the goal of life is, this, God revealing himself to us in order to draw us into a relationship with him, can I just say that this is not just sentimentality or sappy, this is the ultimate goal? Right? In fact, let me just say it like this. I don't know what the goal of your life is today. I don't know when you got up this morning if you thought, okay, here's what I want to accomplish by the time I get to the end of the day, or not. But if this goal was not in there, whatever else you had in mind is probably not worthy. Or let me say it like this. Let's use the far view and say when you die, if there's only one thing on your tombstone and it's not this, then your life was probably lived in vain. If it is this, you're an unmitigated success. Everything else is just details. Abraham is the perfect picture of what God wants to do in all of our lives, and the end result is he became God's best friend. If you become God's best friend, who knows what he might do with you? He might just use you to put the whole world back together. Who knows, right? But the ultimate goal here is this friendship with God, deep friendship with God, which is going to result in holiness and life and flourishing and shalom, and probably have a huge impact on people around you. But those are secondary things. And this friendship with God is the ultimate goal. You see with Abraham, James agrees, and I think that's probably pretty good testimony for us, okay? So there is the story of Abraham. Now, what I want to do today is to take a look at somebody else who we're going to find is really, really different, okay? So let me start up a new PowerPoint here. Not there. Let me start it up. How do I do that? I lose my mind when I get here. Here. Day 1, day 2. Yesterday was going on the offensive, and today is the story of Jacob. Now, the way I want to describe Jacob is I want to describe him as the un-Abraham. Because you might think, okay, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we studied Abraham, so we're going to study Jacob. Jacob's going to be the same thing, and the answer is, no, he's not. He is completely different. Everything Abraham was, Jacob ain't. All right? And why? Why tell this story? Well, it's kind of interesting, as you may have noticed already, that the last 3 days of our study of Genesis are Abraham, not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. Moses very carefully selects who he wants to tell about, and we get a little bit of Isaac, but not much. We get 3 guys who are very different for the purposes of what they reveal about who God is. And Jacob is an interesting story. So let's take a look at where this story starts, and it is the transfer of the promises to Jacob rather than Esau, chapter 25. So let me open up my Bible, and you might want to open up yours too, to Genesis chapter 25, and we're going to take a look at the birth of the twin boys. So Rebekah has 2 boys, and verse 24 says, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. Now, I'm not making this stuff up, and I hope as you read through, you're going to be able to appreciate some of the humor here, okay? I mean, they named the little kid Harry because he's a fuzzy little critter, right? He just is, and it plays into the story a little bit. But that's who he is. He's fuzzy, he's hairy, like a little goat. And then, after this, verse 26, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob, or heel grabber. Now, do we have any Jacobs here? Any Jakes? Oh, in the very back. Yes, Jacob. Nice to have you. So you're all aware of this whole story, the background, the meaning of your name? Yeah. So it's not very flattering, right? I mean, the trouble is it just means deceiver. And here's why. When you grab somebody's heel, you walk behind them and you grab their heel and trip them up and they fall over, well, it's like you've taken advantage from somebody and you kind of snuck up on them, or figuratively, deceiver. Now, sometimes people will go into great lengths looking at the name of a person in the Bible. Sometimes that's a good thing to do, and sometimes it's not, right? I mean, the story of Cain, Doesn't matter about his name or Abel or Seth. But there are some, like Isaac or Abram to Abraham or Jacob, where the meaning of the name is really important. And how do we know when the meaning of the name is really important? And the answer is easy. When the Bible makes a big deal about it. So we're going to watch throughout this storyline today that Moses is going to make a really big deal about the play on the name Jacob. That's why he tells us about it in the very beginning. Okay? So Jacob gets a chance to demonstrate the meaning of his name at least twice. The first way is with the birthright. Now, the boys grow up here, and immediately the birthright becomes an issue. The birthright is simply this. It's a double portion of the inheritance. Now, the way they would do this in the Middle East is you would take however many sons you had, add one number to that, and divide the inheritance up. And what that meant was, here's a little picture of the boys, what it meant was son number 1 got 2, and son number 2 just got 1 piece. So if you had 12 sons, you would add 1 and get 13, divide everything up into 13s, right? And then the oldest son gets 2 13ths, right? Now the reason for that is because the old boy, the old son, has to take care of mom when dad dies and that sort of thing. But here's the point, that Esau is sitting there probably, 4 minutes older than Jacob, and Jacob's saying, my brother is not very smart, and he's all hairy, right? And he's going to get double what I get, and it's just not fair. So he takes advantage of him in a weak moment. His brother, wants the soup, and so Jacob says, hey, I'll give you the soup in exchange for the birthright, and he's not very smart, and so he does it. And he doesn't actually deceive him, but he takes advantage of him in a weak moment, right? It's not a real big deal, but that's the start. The second is the real goal, and that comes into view here in chapter 26, verses 2 to 4. In 26, 2 to 4, again, let me just read it for you. It says, I guess I can read it here and show it to you, can't I? God says, I'll be with you. To your descendants I will give all these lands and confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. So, right here in verses 2 to 4, it's really, really clear that the promises God made to Abraham, he's going to give them to Isaac. Now, you'll totally make my day if you can answer this question. When God first made those promises to Abraham back in Genesis 12, what was the first story that kind of taught us that God was totally, unconditionally committed to keeping those promises for Abraham? Remember what it was? Yeah.
It was where he made Abraham unconscious and the animals he walked through there.
Yeah, Genesis 15, where he took the two halves of the animals and put them down and walked through, is a really, really powerful confirmation of the unconditionality of the promises. That's good. That's a really good answer. But there's actually one story that occurs before that. I mean, that really does it. But there's another story before that. What do you think? Yes, it is exactly when Abraham pretends that Sarah is his sister, right? When she goes down to Egypt, to Pharaoh, and God says, nothing doing, I'm going to keep these promises, and he reaches into the situation and pulls her out, right? So if the writer wanted to demonstrate that the promises of God were really, really, really with Isaac, how might he do it? I don't know. Let's just see. What's the next story here? Oh, wait a minute. Not again. Yes, again. Right? Here it is in chapter 26. And there is Rebekah and Isaac, and Abimelech's the same name, but these two names are different. And sure enough, she goes down to Abimelech, right? And God intervenes. And she comes back, and so the potential for all the promises is there again. And what is the point? Well, if this were just a morality play, we might say, well, let's see, the lesson we learn from this is, boys and girls, your kids will do what you do, not what you say, right? Because Isaac kind of picks up this trait from his dad. But I think there's something bigger going on, and that is this, that he spoke the promises, they are unconditional for Isaac too. Right? So Isaac really does have the very same promises that his father did. It's kind of an interesting story because the way Abimelech finds out that they're really married is he's looking out the window one day And it says he saw Isaac caressing his wife. Now the King James says he saw them sporting. I think that's a funny way to say it, right? It's like, hey, wait a minute, she's not your sister. Sporting. Yeah, we should bring that word back. They were sporting. So anyway, they find out, and she goes back, right? Now, it's not simply that story, but notice this as well. In chapter 26 and verse 12, it says this. Let me just move across the page. It says, Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold. And all the Philistines and people around look at him and say, whoa, we put our seed out and we only got like 2 to 3 times what we put out, and he gets 100. What's going on with that guy? And of course, it is the continuing blessing of God on his life. And I think that the Philistines weren't the only ones to see that, right? I think somebody else who's sitting there back in the tents, who already has a birthright, who's thinking, wow, the birthright is just this, this fixed sum of animals. But if I could have this ongoing blessing, that's what I want, right? So that leads us then to this. The real goal is not just the birthright. The real goal is the blessing. And so chapter 27 shows us how Rebekah and Jacob schemed together to get it. Now, the point of this story is to demonstrate how many times he actually demonstrates his name. We'll look at that in a second. But let me explain to you how it happens. Isaac is old, ready to die, and he's getting ready to pass on the blessing to his son Esau. And so I can't explain to you why this works. I can only explain to you how it happens, and here's how it happens. The father speaks the blessing over the top of the boy. Now, don't ask me why, but that's just how it works, right? He speaks the blessing on there, and when he speaks the blessing, the boy gets it, right? So he says to his son, hey, time for me to die. I'm going to speak the blessing to you, but let's have some fun. You go out and get some game. We'll make a little party of it, and I will give you my blessing, right? So while he's off doing that, Rebekah and Jacob scheme together, and she says, you should go in there and get that. And Jacob says, I know, he's only four minutes older, but he's a big dolt, and so I should get that. And she says, yes, you should. Go in there. And he says, I can't go in there. He might touch me and know that my arms are smooth, not hairy like a goat. Right? And his mom says, it's okay. We'll put goat skins on you, and he'll never know the difference. It's like, what does that tell you about Harry, right? About Esau? I mean, he was a hairy little guy, right? So he does that, and watch the way this story goes. Now, what I want you to do is this. I'm going to read the story, and I want you to kind of count on your fingers how many times Jacob's his dad, all right? So let me read through the story here, and here's how it goes. His mom covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with goatskins, handed to her son Jacob tasty food and the bread she'd made. He went to his father and said, my father. Yes, my son, he answered. Who is it? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau. Right, there's one. I am Esau, your firstborn. 2. Right, I've done as you told me. 3. Right. Please sit up and eat some of my game. There's 4, because this is not really wild game. It's just a goat he and mom got in the backyard. Right. So you may give me your blessing. Isaac asked his son, how did you find it so quickly, my son? Oh, the Lord your God gave me success. 5, right? I mean, if you're going to lie, you might as well bring God into it. It makes it feel so much stronger. Oh, God did it. Yes, he did. Right? Then Isaac said to Jacob, come so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not. Jacob went close to his father. Isaac, who touched him, said, oh, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of a goat or Esau. Right? I can't tell. He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau, right? So there's a 6th time. So he blessed him. Are you really my son Esau, he asked. I am, he replied, right? And so he just keeps going down, and all the way through here, like 10 or 12 or 15 times, he just intentionally, deliberately, right to his face, deceives him and lies to him. So dad gives him the blessing, and he gets it. As soon as he gets it, he goes out, and his brother gets home, and now all of a sudden Isaac recognizes the voice when he says, hey, here I am, your son. He says, oh my goodness. And the text says, in verse 33, Isaac trembled violently, right? Because he knows once he's given out the blessing, he can't get it back. And so he's like, oh no, I don't know who I gave it to, and I gave it to the wrong guy, and he's got it, right? And so he and Esau then sit down and say, let's see now, who is there around here who's in the habit of deceiving people? Right? And so it doesn't take him very long. And verse 35, he said, your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing. Now, I just want to put the text up here again, and I want you to start reading this like in Hebrew, and I want you to notice exactly how this is said. Let's see if I can get it here. Esau said, isn't he rightly named Jacob, or deceiver? He's Jacobed me these 2 times, right? These are the very same word in Hebrew. His name is Jacob, he's Jacobed me, or his name is deceiver, and he's deceived me. He's deceived me these 2 times. He took my birthright, number 1, and now he's taken my blessing, right? So my question for you, after he Jacobs his father so many times, is this. I know you can't answer this for absolute certain, but do your best. Think about the story, look at it, and answer this question. Do you think he's sorry for his behavior? Right? Take 30 seconds, talk to your neighbor, tell me what you think. Okay, talk to me. What do you got? Who's got an answer for me? Yeah, what do you think? You don't think he's sorry? Any reason why you say that?
Well, the first time he took the birthright, and then everything else kind of like happy with him. And then his mother was just like, hey, you want to do this? And he was like, hey, let's do it.
Yeah. I mean, his whole life, you're right? He took the birthright and didn't stop there. Comes back for this. Mom says, you want to do this? The only reason why he objects is because he's afraid his dad will catch him. And as soon as she suggests the goat skins, he says, oh yeah, I'm all in, right? So, I mean, we don't know for sure. I don't want to make too much about this, but I don't think he's sitting around there thinking, oh man, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done that. I mean, he never apologizes. I think, and maybe this surprises you, but I think he's thinking, I got him good, right? Because I feel, as I read the whole story, I just think he's this arrogant, self-sufficient kind of a guy. Now, that may be a surprise to you because you're so used to thinking of Jacob and Abraham and all these guys as these saints, but as you just read his story objectively, he's pretty much a rascal, isn't he? He really is. So let's just read it that way and see where the story goes, right? So where it goes is this. He heads out of town fast because he knows as soon as his dad dies, his brother's going to kill him for taking everything and deceiving him, right? So he decides to head out of town. He leaves and he stops at a place called Bethel on his way all the way up to Padan Aram, right? And while he's at Bethel, it's funny the way the text says he laid down for the night and he put his head on a rock. Which I don't know why it explains that exactly, except that I always wonder which was harder, the rock or his head? And I'm pretty sure his head is harder than the rock, and I'll show you why in a second, right? So he sees this strange dream with these angels going up and down this staircase to God. Now, what in the world's going on? Well, again, I think we can figure it out from the context, but if you go to the New Testament, you get a little bit of help. And one of the helps you get is a place where you wouldn't expect it. Let me show you that story. Right? The dream is a stairway resting on earth with its top reaching to heaven and angels of God ascending and descending on it. And I think what's actually happening is that God's in heaven, Jacob's on the earth, and God is saying to Jacob, I want to have a relationship with you. Now you might think, well, doesn't he already have a relationship with him? And I'm just going to lay it out there. I don't think he does, right? I think he's saying, I'd like to have a relationship with you. So where do you get that? Well, here's where I get it from in the New Testament. There's this story in John chapter 1. Philip found Nathanael and said, we've found the Messiah, right? And Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Kind of a snarky statement, right? And then Jesus meets him. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and exclaimed, look, a true Israelite in whom there is no Jacob, right? So Jesus' statement here reminds us of this story in Genesis, and then watch where it goes. Nathanael asked him, how do you know me? Jesus replied, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now again, it doesn't explain that, but evidently Nathanael knows it's some supernatural insight into his life and what he was doing, right? And he answered, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. And Jesus said to him, because I told you I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You're going to see greater things than these. Now this is a fascinating story. Jesus said, you ain't seen nothing yet. You think this is cool? This is just kids play. You stick with me, and you're going to see something really cool. Nathanael says, what? Jesus says, watch this. I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, obviously, he's taking us back to the story of Genesis, and what he's saying is, you know those stairs? Those aren't just any kind of stairs. Those stairs are me, right? If people on earth want to have a relationship with God, the way they do it is, well, through me. And I really do think this is originally, Jesus is not taking the story out of context. He's using it in context because he knows God is offering a relationship with Jacob because he doesn't actually have one yet. So I'll just lay it out there and tell you, okay? And so God says, look, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to do good things for you, and I'm going to care for you. Now, the reason I don't think they have a relationship is because of the way Jacob responds. In verse 20, Jacob says, if you do good stuff for me over the next few years, then you'll be my God. Now, I've paraphrased a little bit, but I think I've paraphrased it accurately. Jacob says, if you do this, 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 and this, I got a checklist. If you do all that, we'll talk about you being my God. But frankly, I'm getting along just fine right now on my own. If I need something, I just deceive for it, right? Now, part of the reason I think that's such a bad answer on his part is because, again, let me paraphrase Genesis 15:6, right? That really important passage where God said to Abraham, your kids are going to be like the stars of the sky. And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. Is that what Jacob does? Could we say here, Jacob believed God and was credited for righteousness? The answer is no. No. This answer is not like Abraham's answer was, right? And so it seems to me that what happens next is this. Jacob basically refuses this relationship with God, this offer of relationship with him. And now where the story is going to go is this. What will God have to do to Jacob for him to see how much he needs God? And this is where the story really gets interesting. Because now God is going to take this self-confident rascal and start to slowly break down his self-confidence to the point where he finally says, God, I need you. And he's not there yet. Now, I've got to warn you that the story is a little complex. Because you'll notice right here in the next couple of the outlines, there's discipline and blessing, right? God's going to do good for him, and he's going to discipline him at the same time, which is kind of confusing because when God blesses, we tend to think in a very binary fashion. Well, if God's blessing him, he must be his child. But again, we've already seen that's not true, right? We tend to think that God blesses orange people and God curses blue people. But he doesn't, right? God has spoken to Cain and protected him and cared for him. It's a much more complex thing because God sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So when you see God being good to him, God speaking to him, do not assume that he's actually one of God's children. Or, let me just say it very directly, just because God blesses Jacob doesn't mean he is orange any more than it meant Cain was orange, at least at this point. Right? So with that background then, let's take a look at the stories. And the stories are a whole bunch of fun. So, the very first story, chapter 29, God's discipline. And God's discipline for him takes the form of Laban. So let me zero in on the text here. And this is a fun story about meeting Rachel. Right? So he meets Rachel, and he obviously is deeply, madly, head over heels in love. The text says this. See if I can find it here. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Aww, so sweet. This is one lovesick puppy. That's all I want to say, right? He worked 7 years to get her. And then, of course, says Laban, time is up. I want my wife. So, you know what Laban does? He sneaks in the older sister, right? And I don't know how to explain this. Maybe he's just a little bit drunk. I don't know. Maybe the tints are like really dark. but he spends all night with the wrong woman. And I just loved how succinct the text is when it says, when morning came, there was Leah! Exclamation point. Oh no! No! How did this happen? If I could go back in the Bible and just see one thing, I'd love to see his face at that moment. Like, absolute horror, right? And what happens next is even better, because he goes to Laban and says, what are you doing to me? And look at the words, right? Look at these words. They're perfect. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you Jacob me? Exactly, right? And so I just have to imagine in my own mind that Laban is like this big pot-bellied sheriff or somebody with his thumbs in his belt buckle, and he says, you deceived me. He says, yeah, I did. I got you good, boy. Because God is bringing into his life someone who can do to him what he's been doing to everybody else, right? And this is his discipline for him to break down that self-confidence, say, you think you're so hot? You think you can just deceive your way out of anything? I can find people who can out-deceive you. And you're not nearly as independent as you thought you were. So Laban does repent a little bit and say, yeah, that was kind of a dirty trick. I probably shouldn't have done that, right? And you can have Rachel too, but you got to work another 7 years. Right? So here's the way it works. Starts out, he works 7 years, marries Leah, finishes the bridal week, marries Rachel, then works another 7 years to pay her off. So he marries 2 sisters within the span of a week. Not a formula for marital happiness, but it's what they get, right? So what happens next is the story just kind of keeps going. And it goes like this. Because now there is blessing of Jacob in spite of himself in at least 2 ways. Number one, his kids. And when I say his kids, it's a kind of a pun. First of all, his human children, right? So the 2 sisters, I don't know how to say this delicately, but they just have a fertility contest. And you can read the story. It's kind of sad because, like, oh, if I have more kids, maybe my husband will love me more, right? And so they have this fertility contest. And the trouble is, let's bring the kids out here. Leah is ahead like 6-0 before Rachel ever gets on the scoreboard, right? And eventually she does. But in the midst of that whole discussion, there's this one very telling story where Reuben, one of the oldest son of Leah, finds mandrakes. Now you think, what in the world are mandrakes here? Well, let me just read you the story. He finds the mandrakes and brings them to his mother, and Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you now take my son's mandrakes too? Very well, Rachel said. He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. Now, the text doesn't actually say what they are, but you can figure it out, right? They think that if you take the mandrakes and put them by the bed table, that night you will conceive. Now, if you haven't had biology, this could be a hard question, but do plants sitting by the bed cause the wife to conceive? You guys are worrying me. Do they? No, they don't. Just trust me on this, okay? But the bigger, more important question is, do they think they cause you to conceive? And the answer is yes, right? So she gets the mandrakes. God gives her kids, and she's thankful for that, but she kind of thinks, oh, I was so smart with those mandrake plants, right? But the women are not alone, and they're learning this stuff from Jacob because he does the same thing with the other kids, right? The goat kids, right? Because when the animals come and mate in front of the feeding trough, he takes some tree trunks and strips the bark off them so they're striped. Again, the question is, when animals mate in front of striped objects, does it cause the offspring to be striped? Answer, no. More important question, do they think so? Answer, yes, they do, right? So God gives him all sorts of flocks, and he's thinking, oh, I'm so smart. I know the trunk trick, and and God is blessing them in spite of themselves, not because of themselves. So eventually, God says, go back to your home, and he does go. Again, I'm not sure he goes in obedience to God, but he's just tired of living with Laban, and he sneaks away from him, right? He Jacobs away from Laban, as he always does. And so, again, the text is very, very clear about that. It makes a big deal about the way he goes. When Laban had gone to shear sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. And so when Laban finally catches up with him, he looks at him and says, you've Jacobed me. Like, you're surprised by this? Why did you Jacob me? Well, it's who I am. It's what I do best. I mean, and eventually Laban says, well, it's okay that you took everybody and you left. But here's what really ticks me off. Somebody took my gods. I just hate it when someone takes my gods. It just really burns me up. Have you got my gods, right? And he says, no, none of us do. But of course we know who does, right? The story has told us, and she's sitting on top of them in her saddlebags. That's why she's sitting there. But again, notice what she actually says. Rachel said to her father, don't be angry, my lord. I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period. Oh, I'm so sure, right? I mean, she could, but that's not the reason she won't get up. She won't get up because she doesn't want to find the gods, right? Now, I think we actually even have a picture of Rachel up here. Yeah. Oh, no, that's the wrong Rachel. Sorry. But look at this family objectively. What kind of a family are they, right? I mean, they deceive, they steal, they manipulate, they trust in gods, they steal gods. What color would you color this family just objectively at this point? Now, this is not looking good when you look at the whole story, right? So as soon as they escape Laban, they think, oh man, whew, that was great, man. We just rescued our lives there. But they jump from the frying pan right into the fire because now they've got Esau out in front of them. And so as Laban's behind them, but now Esau is in front of them. And so they come towards Esau, and Jacob sends out messengers with lots and lots of money and goods and to meet his brother, as to kind of placate him. And when those messengers get back, Jacob says, did you see my brother? And look what they say to him. This is so cruel. They look at him and say, when the messengers return, we went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. That's it, right? Oh yeah, we saw him. He said he can't wait to meet you. And he's bringing 400 armed men with him. Now, obviously, this is a huge crisis. It's a huge crisis because we see Jacob do something he's never done before. You know what that is? He actually prays. He prays, oh, God of my fathers, you told me to go back here. Please protect me, right? And so what happens is this whole thing happens at this little place called the River Jabock. And this is the little river on the way. And so what happens is he divides his family up into two different groups, thinking if my brother destroys half of them, maybe the other half will get away, sends them across the river, and he wrestles all night with an angel. Now, this story, obviously ancient religious art, there are actually wings here, but in real life, when angels do appear, they never appear with wings, only in visions. But he is wrestling with this man. He's called the man. He touches his hip and eventually puts it out of socket. They ask his name after the fighting, and he overcomes. Now, those are 4 points I want to talk about here, right? So the very first part of it is this. Who is this man? Well, it's an angel or God, who knows exactly, in human form. But Jacob knows that it's at least a representative of God, if not God himself. We know that because at the end of the story, he names the place Peniel, which means I've seen the face of God and have survived. So what he's wrestling for is he's wrestling for security, for safety. Please protect me. Please protect me. I need your blessing, right? And he just keeps wrestling and fighting him for it. And the text goes on to say, and when the man saw he could not overcome him, he touched his hip and put it out of socket. Now, it doesn't mean that the man couldn't overcome him. He could, and obviously he did. He had to pull out nuclear weapons to do it, right, supernaturally, and do it. But I think what it's saying is that if he hadn't done something drastic, Jacob, as stubborn as he is, would have just kept wrestling and wrestling and wrestling, right? So they really are physically going at it like this, and they're fighting back and forth. And so when he touches his hip, he just physically is unable to wrestle anymore. So he has to stop and sit down, right? So as soon as they do, the angel asks him, what's his name? So this is just as important as it was when Adam gave his wife a name, right? Remember that story? In Genesis 3:19, God says, you're going to die. And he turns around and says, I'm going to name my wife Life Giver. And we saw the important theological connection. Same thing here. The guys are not sitting down there like, man, that was really, really hard. And by the way, I don't think I caught your name. What's your name? You know, that's not what's going on. You're sitting there, resting, can't fight anymore. And the angel says, look, if you want the blessing, the only way you're going to get it is to tell me who you are. Right? This is not about knowing a name. This has to do, what this does is it brings all the weight of the rest of the story with it because the name is so important. So when the angel says to him, tell me your name, he's saying, tell me what you are inside, right? So if I can just dramatize it, give me a little liberty here, I think it probably went something like this, right? The angel says to him, if you want this blessing, you got to tell me your name. And Jacob says, okay, that's what you want. That's what I'll do. I'll tell you my name. My name is, if you want to know what I am down deep inside, I'm, I'm a deceiver. And I'm a liar, and I'm a manipulator, and I'm a cheater, and I depend on myself, and I do everything that's in my best interest. And the angel does not look at him and say, oh, I had no idea you were such a terrible person, right? The angel looks at him and says, you are all that and more than you know. But I'm so glad that you finally come to recognize who you are, and you are exactly right. That is exactly what you are. You are rotten to the core, and there's nothing good in you. But because you have confessed who you are, admitted that to me, and asked for the blessing, you know what? I will change your name. And I will give you a new name, and it will be Israel instead of Jacob. It will be the one who has wrestled and overcome, because now you've overcome. Now, let me explain just very quickly how he overcomes, right? How does Jacob overcome? And this is the way. He doesn't overcome by fighting. He overcomes in the story because he stops fighting, and then he confesses his character, and then he asks for the blessing in faith. Now, let's just draw a little rectangle around that. Inside that little rectangle, right here on the banks of the Jabock River, what just happened to Jacob? You see this? What happens when he gives up, admits who he is, and comes to God in faith? I think he just turned from this kind of a Jacob into this kind of a Jacob, right? And I think what's amazing is that when you move on from here and you take a look at chapter 35, God speaks to him and says, hey, you know that place where you had that dream? Let's go back there and start over. Go back to Bethel, and I want you to build an altar to me. And in chapter 35, he says, yes, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And he says, by the way, Rachel, let's get rid of those household gods. And give me all the idols, and we're going to melt them down, and we're going to start honoring God. And it says, the fear of God spread to all the people around. There's a definite change in this guy at this point. And so, here's where I want to go then. I want to finish with this. Two things. First one's this. Number one, why would God call himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? When he calls himself the God of Abraham, that's one thing. When he calls himself the God of Jacob, that's another, right? Think about that phrase. What does it mean? He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then, in the quietness of your own heart, as you look at your own life, this next question, do you identify more with Abraham or with Jacob? Down deep inside, who are you? If God came to you and said, what is your name? How would you answer? And so in some sense, when you start to think about who this God is, it's an amazing comfort to know that he is not only the God of Abraham's, he's the God of Jacob's. Just in case there's sometimes you feel like you're more like a Jacob than an Abraham.